The woman sat down at my table without asking. She was shaking so badly that the glass of water in her hand trembled against the table, and before I could even ask who she was, she leaned toward me and whispered, "Pretend you know me." My ex just walked in. I looked over her shoulder. A tall man in a charcoal suit had just entered the restaurant. The moment he saw her, his expression changed. Not to surprise, not to anger, to recognition. And somehow, the fear in the woman's eyes told me that whatever had happened between them was much darker than a simple breakup. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can change someone's life, that strangers can become family, and that everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel. You never know when a small act of kindness might become the reason someone decides not to give up. My name is Nathan Carter, and at the time, I was 36 years old, living alone in Chicago, Illinois, and working as an architectural consultant. I wasn't rich, famous, or particularly interesting. I was just a man who had learned, sometimes painfully, that life could change in a single moment. That evening, I had gone to an upscale restaurant downtown because I needed somewhere quiet to eat after a difficult week. My company had lost an important contract, my apartment lease was about to expire, and I had been spending most nights wondering whether the life I had built was slowly falling apart. I remember sitting by the window, staring at the rain sliding down the glass, thinking about how strange adulthood was. When we were young, we thought the hardest part of life would be finding success. We never realized that sometimes the hardest part was simply finding a reason to keep going when success didn't look the way we imagined. Then she appeared. She was beautiful, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the fear in her face. She had long brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders, a cream-colored dress, and a small purse clutched tightly against her side. She looked like someone who had walked into the restaurant expecting a peaceful evening and suddenly found herself trapped inside a nightmare. She stopped beside my table, looked directly into my eyes, and asked if she could sit down. Before I could answer, she did. Her breathing was uneven. She lowered her voice and repeated that I needed to pretend I knew her. I didn't understand. But then I saw the man across the restaurant. He was watching us. He was standing near the entrance, perfectly composed, holding a phone in one hand. His name, I would later learn, was Marcus Whitmore. At that moment, however, all I knew was that he was staring at the woman sitting across from me as if she belonged to him. I decided to play along. I smiled at her and casually asked how her day had been, pretending she was an old friend. She immediately relaxed a little. She placed her hand on the table, and I noticed a faint bruise near her wrist. That tiny mark changed everything. I realized she wasn't afraid of an awkward ex-boyfriend. She was afraid of him. Marcus slowly walked toward us. The woman leaned closer and told me that if he asked, my name was Nathan. We had known each other for years, and she was waiting for me because we had plans after dinner. I nodded. When Marcus finally reached our table, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that looked friendly from a distance but felt cold when you were close enough to see the eyes behind it. He greeted her by name, asking why she hadn't returned his calls. She didn't answer. I calmly told him that she was having dinner with me. He looked at me for several seconds. Then he asked if I was her boyfriend. I looked at the woman. She was staring at the table, so I said yes. The word came out before I had time to think about the consequences. Marcus's smile disappeared. He leaned toward me and quietly said that I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Then he walked away. The woman didn't breathe normally again until he had left the restaurant. I asked her what was happening. Her name was Grace Bennett. She told me she had dated Marcus for almost 4 years. At first, he had been charming, generous, and protective. He remembered small details about her, sent flowers to her workplace, and told everyone that she was the woman he wanted to marry. But slowly, things changed. He began deciding who she could talk to, then what she could wear, then where she could go. He wanted access to her phone. He questioned every late arrival. He became jealous of coworkers and friends. Whenever she tried to establish boundaries, he accused her of not loving him. She told me that emotional control had slowly become intimidation, and intimidation had eventually become physical. The bruise on her wrist wasn't the first. It was simply the first one she hadn't managed to hide. 3 weeks earlier, Grace had finally left him. She packed one suitcase, stayed with a friend outside the city, changed her phone number, and believed she had escaped. But Marcus kept finding ways to reach her. That evening, he had discovered where she was staying. She had come to the restaurant because she thought a public place would be safer. Then she saw him walk through the door. I listened without interrupting. There was something about Grace's story that reminded me of my younger sister, Hannah, who had once gone through a difficult relationship. She had survived it, but I remembered how everyone around her had told her to just leave, as if walking away from someone you loved was as simple as closing a door. Sometimes people don't need someone to tell them what they should have done. Sometimes they need someone to stand beside them while they find the strength to do it. I told Grace she didn't have to face Marcus alone. She looked at me as though those words meant more than I could understand. Then Marcus came back. This time, he wasn't alone. Two men were standing behind him. My heart started pounding. I quietly reached for my phone beneath the table and contacted the restaurant manager. I explained that there was a woman being threatened and asked them to call security and the police. Grace noticed what I was doing. For the first time that night, I saw a little hope in her eyes. Marcus approached the table and demanded that Grace come with him. I stood up. I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't some fearless hero. My hands were actually shaking. But courage isn't the absence of fear. Sometimes courage is simply deciding that another person's fear matters more than your own. I told Marcus that Grace had made her decision and that he needed to leave. He laughed. Then he told me I was making a serious mistake. One of his friends stepped closer. Before anything could happen, the restaurant manager arrived with security. Within minutes, the police were there. Marcus tried to explain everything away. He claimed Grace was confused and that I was interfering in a private relationship. But Grace finally spoke. She told the officers everything. And this time, she didn't whisper. She told them about the controlling behavior, the threats, the bruises, the phone calls, the stalking, and the night she had finally escaped. Her voice shook, but she kept talking. The officers took Marcus outside for questioning, and later that evening, they helped Grace begin the process of obtaining legal protection. When the restaurant became quiet again, Grace sat across from me. She looked exhausted. She also looked different, stronger. She thanked me for helping her. I told her I hadn't done much. She shook her head and said that was exactly what people always said after helping her. They thought kindness was something small because they didn't understand what it felt like to be completely alone. Then she told me something I would never forget. She said that when she saw me sitting alone by the window, she chose my table because I looked like someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. I smiled and told her that was probably because I had spent years avoiding my own. She laughed for the first time. It was a small laugh, but it changed the entire room. Over the next few weeks, Grace and I stayed in contact. At first, I helped her find a temporary apartment. Then I drove her to appointments when she didn't feel safe going alone. I helped her move her belongings from her friend's house. But something unexpected happened. Grace began rebuilding her life. She returned to work. She started painting again, something she had abandoned during her relationship. She joined a small community group. She started smiling more. And I started realizing that I had been rebuilding something too. My life had become smaller after my divorce several years earlier. I had convinced myself that being alone was easier than being disappointed. I worked constantly because work couldn't leave you, betray you, or wake up one morning and decide you weren't enough. But Grace taught me something. Being alone and being lonely were not the same thing. And sometimes, the person you help stand up becomes the person who reminds you how to stand again yourself. 6 months later, I received a phone call from Grace. She told me she had moved into a new apartment and had started working with women who were leaving abusive relationships. She wanted to help other people the way someone had helped her. I told her I was proud of her. Then she invited me to an event her organization was hosting. When I arrived, I saw dozens of women sitting together, listening to stories of survival. Grace stood on a small stage. She looked confident. She looked peaceful. And then she told the audience about the night she sat down at a stranger's table and whispered, "Pretend you know me." She didn't mention my name. She simply said that a stranger had chosen kindness when it would have been easier to look away. Then she said something that made my eyes fill with tears. She said, "Sometimes God sends help in a form we don't recognize. Sometimes it isn't a miracle falling from the sky. Sometimes it's simply a person sitting at the next table who decides your fear matters." I looked down because I didn't want anyone to see me crying. But I was. Because I realized something that night. I thought I had saved Grace. The truth was, Grace had saved something inside me too. She reminded me that life wasn't only about what we lost. It was about what we chose to give after losing it. A year later, Grace opened a small nonprofit organization in Chicago dedicated to helping people leave dangerous relationships and rebuild their lives. I volunteered whenever I could, and eventually, she became one of my closest friends. Not because of the dramatic night at the restaurant, not because she needed rescuing, but because after surviving the worst chapter of her life, she chose to become a source of hope for someone else. One evening, we returned to that same restaurant. We sat at the same table by the window. Grace looked around the room and smiled. She told me that she still remembered how terrified she had been that night. I told her I remembered how brave she actually was. She shook her head and said she hadn't felt brave. I told her that was the point. Bravery doesn't always feel powerful. Sometimes bravery looks like a trembling hand reaching for a phone. Sometimes it looks like saying the truth after years of silence. Sometimes it looks like walking away with one suitcase and no idea what tomorrow will bring. And sometimes, bravery looks like sitting down at a stranger's table and asking someone to pretend they know you because you're finally ready to escape the person who convinced you nobody would believe you. Grace smiled. Outside, Chicago's lights reflected across the wet streets. The restaurant was full of people laughing, eating, celebrating birthdays, and living ordinary lives. And I thought about how close we all are to someone else's breaking point without ever knowing it. The woman sitting beside you on a train might be carrying a secret. The cashier serving your coffee might be struggling. The person smiling at work might have cried in their car 5 minutes earlier. We rarely know what people are carrying. That's why kindness matters. Because you don't always get to see the ending when you help someone. You may never know what your 5 minutes of patience meant. You may never know what your simple "are you okay?" prevented. You may never know how much courage your presence gave someone. But sometimes, one small act of kindness becomes the first page of an entirely different life. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need to hear them at exactly the right moment. And before we end, I want you to do something special. Comment, "Kindness can save a life," below if you believe that one compassionate person can make a difference in someone else's darkest moment. Because Grace taught me something I will never forget. You don't have to be rich to change someone's life. You don't have to be powerful. You don't have to know the perfect words. Sometimes all you have to do is notice that someone is afraid and choose not to walk away. And somewhere in Chicago, at a little restaurant beside a rainy window, there is still a table where a stranger once sat down and whispered, "Pretend you know me." I did. But the truth is, by the time that night was over, I didn't feel like a stranger anymore. I felt like I had been given the privilege of witnessing someone choose her life again. And I will always believe that was the real miracle.